Chapter 3. Constant Desnoix, or the farmer who broke his word. He came back. He came back alone. He had hunted all through the night without finding a warm trail. He lay in wait for red partridges and leapt into the middle of the covey, too directly, without any guile, and his teeth closed on emptiness. But even if he had eaten the flesh of young hares or partridges that night, he would still have returned in rage and defiance at his humiliation. He, Reynard, had been made to look a fool. And by whom? By the farmer's cock, and what was more, by Chippet, who had been fat, succulent fox's meat ever since tender fowls and hungry Reynards had existed. He had lived through the scene 20 times. He had seen himself carrying Chanticleer in his jaws, holding him tightly enough to keep him captive, but loosely enough not to pierce his skin. What a fine attacking leap! What a masterly stroke! Chanticleer of the watchful eye, the sentinel, the herald with the strident trumpet. Reynard had taken him. He was carrying him away. It was all over. And from then on he could snaffle the hens. He could take one a day. Ah, Constant, it was not your fault, but mine. The wealthiest farmer in the hamlet, rich in goslings, ducklings, and capons, he was so mean that he never put even the smallest of his pigeons or the toughest of his broody hens into the stew pot. And who was he keeping them for? Thought Reynard, if not for me? Ermelyn had guessed everything. When Reynard reached Malpass on the previous day, he was panting so hard that he had evidently been in some fierce chase. Perhaps she had even heard the dogs barking on the plain. She had not made the slightest complaint at dawn this morning, after the unsuccessful night's hunting. She was a courageous wife, a true female Reynard accustomed to the hard laws of wild nature, devouring big meals with enjoyment, but stoical when times were bad. As he left their earth, with the first warm rays of sunshine, Reynard had felt her fine eyes follow him from the depths of the darkness along the road to his new adventure. He must not delay. Someone like Constant Desnoix, who was so mean and seedy, would never imagine such boldness. No fox would dare reappear near the buildings the very day after such a fright and slip into the enclosure again. Reynard's calculations were right. The farmhands were in the fields. Bronwyn, Constant's wife, had washed the hemp and the wool, and had gone into the little town to sell the thread that had been wound during the winter. Reynard found the ditch again and squeezed under the fence. Fortune favoured his boldness. It was like one of those happy dreams through which one flies on the wings of birds. Who had seen him? Nobody, he was convinced. Capons, chickens, hens and cock were all gathered round the manure heap. He was on the right side of the wind. He would wait, hidden beneath the broad cabbage leaves, until Chanticleer's walk brought him within leaping distance. All beasts, even beasts of prey, know that they must wait. They must wait for the right moment, the exact distance. The heavy purple shadow of the big cabbages dimmed the glow of his watchful eyes. Reynard held his breath, waiting. The entire farmyard was pecking, cackling, and gradually scattering round the manure heap in the sun, while steam rose from it. In the big meadow adjoining the yard, Farrant the mare ran up and down, and the ground shook as she joined her gambolling foal to caress him. A shadow fell over the pathway. Something leapt softly, something spat. Reynard made himself small and flat, but it was too late, for the cat had caught sight of him. Not Tibbet, the wild cat, who had made a kill in the forest that night. Reynard had seen his leavings, but Constant's black tomcat. Arching his back, he recoiled, hissing. All the poultry heard the warning and began to screech. The cat leapt back and streaked towards the house. What an uproar! And what could Reynard do? He hesitated for a brief moment, hoping that the disturbance would soon calm down of its own accord if he remained motionless beneath the broad cabbage leaves. But a fearful wind of terror continued to blow. The whole farmyard was fluttering away, scattering in the wake of the cat, the hens leading, the chickens behind them, then the ducks, then the ducklings, hissing, falling over each other, their sterns bumping against the ground. They all clamoured together, and yet there was only one cry, stirred by the memory of the previous day's drama, a shriek of fear and hate which rose above the rooftops. "The fox! The fox!" Reynard made up his mind and rushed towards the ditch. "Who's there?" said a man's voice. It was Constant Desnoix himself, standing upright like the scarecrow in the orchard, but walking and talking aloud. He had a net in his hands. Reynard could be caught again before coming out of the cabbages. He had barely moved, but Constant Desnoix had seen him. He cast his net, which was the colour of blue smoke. He cast it clumsily, for since he was a farmer he had neither hunted nor snared birds in all his life. Reynard jumped, got one paw entangled, freed himself, got another paw entangled, then lay down on one side, his head at an angle, his neck extended, waiting for the farmer to attack. "Got you!" said Constant Desnoix. And he placed his foot on the fox's white throat. If only the unfortunate man, before running into the yard, had taken the time to put on his clogs, his good birchwood shoes. Reynard measured the distance, selected his place, and bit him hard, right on the heel. "Mercy me!" cried the farmer. He almost fainted, and fell down on one knee. Reynard bit him even harder, and in order to free his foot, Constant put his right hand in front of him. Reynard merely said, finding just time to take Constant Desnoix's hand in addition to his foot between his teeth. And he bit deeply and more deeply still, cheerfully tasting the salty blood, deaf to cries, unresponsive to prayers, but thinking to himself none the less, "Cursed be the mouth that speaks when it should be silent. Who will tire first? Not I warrant, if I can go by his face." "Master Fox," groaned Constant, "friend Reynard, good Reynard, for pity's sake, I'll be your liegeman. Reynard, myself, my belongings, you can have everything. Only let me go, I beg you, let me go." "Humph," muttered the fox from the depths of his throat, and the farmer, thinking he said no, only redoubled his pleas. "By St. Clement, St. Remy, St. Romacle, St. Anne, St. Lucy, and Holy Charity, by all the saints who are your saints, Reynard, I put myself at your mercy. Oh, my hand! Ow, my foot!" Reynard saw him turn as white as a sheet, and when he felt him grow as limp as a rag, his heart filled with pity. "Is that true, farmer?" he said in the end, but his teeth were still bared, his eyes still wary, and his spine taut. "First of all, take me out of this net." The farmer obeyed, complaining about his bleeding foot and hand, but his colour was already coming back, and as he shook himself, Reynard said, "I will only ask you for one thing." "What is that, sir?" "Your cock, Chanticleer." The farmer scratched his head. "My cock?" "You heard what I said." "Why my cock? He's so thin and tough." "No more so than you," thought Reynard, running the tip of his tongue over his lips. "The farmer's beating about the bush, I think." "You'd better have 3 fine capons," went on Constant Desnoix, "as tender and soft as the dew." Your cock, said Reynard, grumbling, "or if you prefer, I'll have your foot again." "Very well, my lord," said the farmer. "My cock, on my honour you'll have him tomorrow." "Tomorrow it shall be. I'll wait for him at this very place." Constant Desnoix turned away a little to hide a secret smile. There was something in the air, some hovering danger, some menace, but both the fox and the man had heard at the same time the axle of a cart creaking over the plain. The farmhands must be returning. It was time for them to eat. To eat! Was there anyone who was not going to eat? Even Morholt, who was barking over there as he leapt round the cart, was going to eat in a moment. The fox's eyes blazed. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Farmer, you have pledged me your word. Bring your cock to the festival cross when the steeple bell rings out the Angelus. I'll be there." And he disappeared. As soon as his wife came back from the town, Constant Desnoix told her the story, and Bronwyn, who was gracious and pretty, a true daughter of Eve in guile and trickery, listened to him at first without saying a word. "He was such a good cock, my dear," groaned Constant Desnoix. "He was prompt, punctual, and never let us down. All his hens were happy." And Bronwyn, reflecting silently within herself, sighed. "Oh dear." "Isn't it a shame?" the farmer went on. "But what could I do? I gave my word of honour." "Then you must take him," said Bronwyn. Are you angry?" said the wretched husband. Take him, my friend. You swore you would do it. That's Fox's honour." "But what shall we do?" repeated the farmer. A dimple appeared in Bronwyn's cheeks as she bent down and put her warm lips against his ear, whispering for several moments, and then Constant Desnoix smiled. At the same time, Ermelin was listening to Reynard at Malpas. "And tomorrow morning," he said finally, "tomorrow morning, when the church bell rings, I shall be at the cross." "But he won't be there," said Ermelyn. "He will. He gave me his word of honour." "Farmer's honour," said Ermelyn. "Enough," replied Reynard. "He has understood, for I bit him hard." And next day, at daybreak, Reynard was in the boundary ditch, looking down the path across the plain. A few yards away stood the tall festival cross on its stone base, the faded flowers from Rogation Day still adorning the open stonework heart. Just as the cheerful tinkling of the Angelus bell rang out, he saw Constant appear in the distance. The sky was already blue. The world had rarely seen a more radiant spring, and it made the bad fortune of Reynard and his family and the hunger that tormented them seem all the more of a bitter mockery. But Constant was carrying a well-stuffed sack on his shoulders. "Good," thought Reynard. "I was right." He felt pleased and began to swing his tail from side to side. Constant Desnoix continued to come towards him, limping a little because of his injured foot. "What a weight," thought the fox. "It's even bigger and heavier than it looked from a distance. I know that Chanticleer has stout limbs, but my man must have given me good measure. He must have put the 3 capons with him too." When he was a few feet away from the boundary, the farmer lowered his sack onto the moss with a twist of his shoulders. "Help yourself, Reynard," he called out, "and leave me the empty sack. You won't have any use for it." Reynard jumped over the ferns, his nose towards the sack. His eyes were not wide enough open to see that something was kicking inside it. When he touched it, he was stopped by a smell so violent that his hackles rose before he had really understood. "After him, more halt!" shouted the farmer. "After the fox!" The mastiff leapt out of the bag like an arrow, but he was too late. Reynard was disappearing into the midst of a bramble thicket. But before he was out of sight, he shouted at the peasant in a piercing voice that could be heard from the church steeple to Malpas. "Constant Desnoix, you've broken your word. You've broken your word. But I'll have my revenge, farmer."